Assalamu'alaikum Warahmatullahi Wabarakatuh. Here we are from a group. We will presentation and explain about the material for grammar and vocabulary. So for the first speaker is from Lula.
8.1 Introduction. These chapters follow the two-part structure of the preceding two chapters and focuses first on materials for teaching vocabulary and then on grammar teaching materials. Vocabulary teaching, for example, cannot be reduced to the level of simply learning words. Probably, the most common procedure used as models for grammar materials and for grammar teaching, and conclude by recommending principal eclecticism. Okay, for the next material will be delivered by Yulisa Widyaningtyas.
Materials for vocabulary introduction. It is generally acknowledged that vocabulary is a vital aspect of language learning. Wilkins, 1972, remarks on the relative importance of vocabulary and grammar. Without grammar, very little can be conveyed. Without vocabulary, nothing can be conveyed. In addition to word frequency, we need also to consider collocation and lexical phrases for which separate frequency lists have been published. Smith 2010 gives the following figures for words. Native speakers typically know 1600 to 2000 word families. Learners need a vocabulary of 800 words to read unsimplified material. Learners need to know between 200 and 300,000 words for reasonable understanding and use. The next material will be delivered to Lula.
Vocabulary selection and vocabulary knowledge. Frequency as a criterion. Common sense criterion for vocabulary selection is frequency. And the contemporary material writer, as we have known, is well served in this respect, as word frequency lists from large corpora such as COCA and BNC are available, along with collection and lexical phrases lists. An important question for us as materials writers, if we accept that frequency is a useful criterion, is how can we ensure that frequent words are incorporated in the materials? There will seem to be three possibilities. 1. List of topic-related vocabulary for each unit. 2. Construction text to incorporate the target vocabulary. 3. Select vocabulary from texts which have been included in the material for the other purpose. Example, reading and listening board. It is important to note that these options are not mutually exclusive, and it may be both necessary and desirable to combine them to ensure that learners get adequate exposure to high-frequency activity. Okay, the next material will be delivered by Yulisa Widyaningtyas.
Selection criteria for collocation and lexical phrases. While the selection criteria we have noted are relatively well established for words and are to some extent transferable to collocation and lexical phrases, we need to consider whether specific criteria are required for these items. The following criteria for the selection of collocation are suggested by Timis 2008. Frequency, difficulty, semantic predictability, strength of collocation, and the last is pedagogic convenience. Beyond frequency, we obviously need to consider criteria other than the frequency in our vocabulary selection. And what 1888, 48 to 50 goes beyond frequency to consider a number of other interesting and useful selection criteria. 1. Frequency of use. 2. Coverage. 3. Range. 4. Availability. 5. Learnability. 6. Opportunism. And the last is centers of interest. The next material will be delivered to Intan.
Vocabulary learning in materials. Bring back old-fashioned technique. We must now turn our attention to practical ways of incorporating vocabulary work into materials. In this respect, it is interesting to note that certain traditional activities have enjoyed something of renaissance recently, learning vocabulary from lists and bilingual dictionary. Semantic and thematic sets. In particular, the very common practice in both materials and the general teaching of presenting words in semantic sets has been questioned. False, however, claims that it is more effective to present vocabulary in thematic sets rather than semantic ones, and suggests that family vocabulary could be presented in a thematic set through a story about a trip to the beach which involves a number of family members. There are, of course, other ways of grouping vocabulary than by semantic sets. And the next material will be delivered by Malik.
First is depth processing. Despite the sometimes conflicting views about how vocabulary should be taught, Cameron in 2001 illustrates the depth of processing used to present vocabulary for leisure activities to young learners. One, the teachers memes the leisure activities, for example, like swimming, cycling, and says the words at the same time. Two, the teacher says the words and the pupils mime the activity. Three, the pupils draw three of the activities. The teacher reads out the words and the first pupil to hear three of the words he has drawn is the winner. And two, for the second is vocabulary learning strategies. Odell, Falls, and Nation all emphasize the value of vocabulary learning strategies. Falls does not prioritize particular strategies, but argues that the key factor is that learners have an individualist set of strategies that they apply consistently. We can see a role for materials then in presenting and modeling different vocabulary learning strategies with which learners can experiment with and then choose those which they find most effective. And the next material will be delivered by
Evaluating vocabulary work in materials. As materials developers, we need to be able to generate sound and practical design principles for vocabulary work from the theoretical discussion above. Materials can help teachers in the following ways. 1. Providing clearly marked vocabulary lessons. 2. Making the target vocabulary set stand out, including focus, practice, and regular review. And the last, giving lists of vocabulary to be learned for the lessons. And the next material will be delivered by Malik. I mean by Putri.
Point 3, materials for teaching grammar. Introduction. The place of grammar teaching in the language classroom has been a matter of intense debate for some time. It is somewhat ironic then that the place of grammar in published materials seems to be a matter of orthodoxy. In this strength, 2013 regard the preoccupation of coursebook with grammar as obsessive, while Waters 2012 note that the preoccupation of a particular best-selling coursebook with grammar, except for a few cosmetic changes, had actually increased over recent years despite continued theoretical uncertainty about the place of grammar teaching. A grammar syllabus. These problems may not actually be with the big grammatical topics such as tense or conditional, but may lie in the area of what Timis 2008 refers to as microgrammar, for example, reporting patterns with specific verbs, for example, blame something on someone, verb and preposition combination, example, depend on, rely on, gerund or infinitive choice, example, I have to go, I don't mind going. And the next material will be delivered to
methodology for grammar materials, methodological options. We have not a consensus that some kind of focus on grammar makes a difference, while PPP appears to be the dominant methodology in course books. A range of options is open to the material writer. Among the options listed by Swan 2006 are first, deductive texting through explanation and example. Second, inductive discovery activities. Third, the contextualized practice. Fourth, communicative practice. Fifth, incidental focus on from during communicative text. Sixth, teacher correction and records. Seventh, grammar games. Eighth, learning rules and examples by heart. Present practice produce criticism and rehabilitation. This procedure typically involves the presentation of the target structure in some kind of illustrative context and the explanation and or elicitation of the form, meaning and use of the target structure. This is followed by control practice where the learners manipulate the target item in drills or exercise, and pre-practice where the focus is still on the target form, but the learner have more freedom over what to say. The next presentation will be delivered by
beyond present practice produce. As materials writers, we need then to consider options other than PPP. We turn first to input-based approach, which focus on the relationship between input, the language the learner is exposed to, and intake, that part of the input which becomes part of the learner's potential productive repertoire. The conclusion from this materials is that materials need to encourage learners to pay conscious attention to form in input in order for the language they encounter, for example, in listening and reading text, to become available as output. Practice, quality not quantity. The argument Dickaser 2003 in that learners can through intensive, meaningful practice develop automatic control of structures that have initially been learned explicitly. It is important to emphasize here that the practice needs to be meaningful. Practice is not just a matter of quantity, but also of quality. Principles eclecticism. Eclecticism is easy to achieve, but we must return to the notion of principal eclecticism in deciding on an appropriate option. Materials developed then have to consider a range of factors, as we have seen above, in relation to the learners and the structure to be taught. With this research evidence support, we would argue is principal eclecticism. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to grammar materials. That is a challenge, but it also makes life interesting. The next material will be delivered to the
Further reading 1. McCartin 2007 points out that while spoken and written vocabulary have much in common and differ in some respects, she describes and exemplifies several categories in the interactive vocabulary of conversation, noting, however, that certain words or phrases may fall into more than one category. 1. Discourse markers. 2. Responses. 3. Monitoring expression. 4. Vague expressions. Hedging and expression of stance. The next material will be delivered by Malik.
The definitions and explanations below are extracts from McCartan. 1. Discourse markers. A discourse marker is a word or phrase that or manages the discourse in some way. In this case, the type of discourse is conversation. 2. Response. Words and expression that people use to respond to what other people say before they add their contribution to the conversation. 3 is monitoring expression. In conversation, speakers often involve the other participants to measure how the conversation is going. 4 is fake expression. This includes expression that use very general, often informal words instead of specific words to refer to things, activities, or situation. 5. Expressions of stance. Stance refer to how speakers express their attitude to what they say. So, for example, they may give information as a personal opinion and use expression. And 6 is hedging expression. Speakers use hedging expressions when they want to avoid sounding blunt, to direct, to sure of themselves, or to black and white. Next. 8.5 Further reading 2. This chapter is highly critical on grammar. Strengths in 2013 initial complaint is that grammar has a dominant role in course book, which seems to him obsessive. Other than that, the grammar work is randomly lexicalist, that the vocabulary used to exemplify and practices structure is not the vocabulary typically used with that structure. Bieber and Conrad in 2010, for example, note that there are certain verbs which are typically used in the present continuous. For example, joking, bleeding, and starving. The grammar practice typically provided in course books, Strang's argues, is too often highly controlled and the contextualist despite this complaint. However, he argued that materials writers do not have complete freedom to design grammar materials according to their own principle, but have to take into account the extent to which any adopted methodology meets the expectation of learners, teachers, and the educational culture within which the learners and teachers work. Finally, Strang's observed that grammar should be exemplified through language which represents realistic use and calls for production activities that allow learners to make meaningful utterances and to say things which they might con conceivably want to say in the real world. And the next material will be delivered by Gharini.
8.6 Conclusion. In this chapter on designing materials for teaching vocabulary and grammar, several points have been concluded as related to section 8.2 on developing material for teaching. Here are some conclusions. 1. Corpus research has given us clearer picture of the number of words a lesson requires. 2. Efficient vocabulary learning is essential for language learning to learn. 3. Learning cannot happen by chance to learn enough vocabulary. 4. To determine what vocabulary will be taught to students, it can be seen from the learning abilities of students and also the interest of the students. 5. A word is studied to learning its basic meaning only, while learning the word healthy is an additional process that students can get when studying in class. 6. Research has suggested that some popular techniques such as learning word in semantic sets are not effective, but research also suggests that some learning from techniques such as translation or learning from lists is effective. So, The next presentation will be delivered by Yulisa.
Then section 8.3 with respect to grammar teaching materials. Conventional grammar can be included in textbook and describe three possible reasons for including grammar in the material. 1. It is a market desire. 2. Facilitating communication. And the last is educational development. We refer back to chapter 2 on SLA to remind ourselves of the consensus that some kind of grammar teaching seems to accelerate progress and accuracy. We suggested that an enabling view of grammar forces us to consider what a particular grammar structure will do to help our learners communicate. We argued for principled eclecticism, whereby the approach to grammar teaching takes into account both the nature of the point to be taught and learner factors such as age, level, and need. We also noted that quality of practice is more important than quantity of practice.
Okay.